In today's political climate, change in Washington is the only guarantee. And when small businesses aren't plugged in, they pay the price. That's why NSBA keeps you hardwired to what's happening inside D.C.
Hi, Jack. How are you this morning?
Hey, Molly. How you doing?
I'm doing good, thanks. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for this week's episode of Hardwired, where we keep you connected to everything happening in D.C. Tell us a little bit about what happened last week. Give us the update.
I was over down on the Hill last week. There was a markup hearing in the House Committee on Small Business where they considered several pieces of legislation, two of them regarding fraud and lending practices, and one of them concerning the establishment of a Native American office within SBA. All of those bills were bipartisan. All of them passed unanimously out of committee. They might eventually be considered before the full House at some point during the legislative year. So it's something we're going to be continuing to monitor. Over on the Senate side, we saw Ranking Member Markey host a field hearing where he announced the introduction of the Spark Act. This is a bill that would establish a grant program for small businesses to beef up or establish their infrastructures. We were really happy to see this bill be introduced. We lent our support and endorsement for it as well.
It has been a lot of bipartisanship and something we really like to hear. Speaking of which, talk to me a little bit about that interesting vote on tariffs in the House.
Right. So this is also bipartisan to some extent. You had obviously the entire class of Democrats in the House and a handful of Republicans joined together in opposition to some of the tariff policies that have come from the administration. As a reminder, over at NSBA, we have consistently called for a small business exemption on some of these tariff policies. Important to keep in mind that these sorts of gestures taking place on the Hill don't have much of a direct impact on the policies. Ultimately, the power to determine whether the administration can use these tariffs rests with the Supreme Court. We're still awaiting for their decision on that. We could be waiting for a few months longer. It's another thing we're continuing to monitor.
I'd like you to also talk a little bit about the changes to the SBA 7A loan. That's their major flagship loan program over at SBA that a lot of small businesses utilize. Talk to us about that change.
Yeah, they're proposing some policy changes over there where essentially if a small business is owned in any part by a non-U.S. citizen, including green card holders, then these changes would prohibit those businesses from being able to receive loans through the program. Obviously, it's very important for us that small businesses are not overly targeted during these practices. It's very important for us to emphasize that these are loan programs as well, and that they are not a give out. Small businesses have to pay these back, and they do. So we're opening up the channels of communication on that policy and making sure that we're advocating for the best for our membership and all small businesses.
You know, we always talk about the loans with 7A and how important it is, but even bigger than that is all the job creation that comes out of those small businesses that grow because of those loans. And so it's got pretty broad economic implications. And so I know that's why you're keeping a close eye on it. Speaking about programs that have big implications for our members, tell us a little bit about the SBIR program. I know there's been some steps forward, a couple steps back. What's the latest?
You know, at the beginning of last week, we were feeling pretty optimistic that legislation might be put forth soon and that a compromise had been struck between different interests on the Hill. Unfortunately, negotiations took a bit of a step back from what I've been hearing. There were a few provisions that they couldn't quite come to terms with at the end of that process. So they're back to the drawing board, but negotiations are ongoing. Everybody has a vested interest in wanting something to happen here. So we're remaining optimistic that we're going to see movement on some form of legislation being introduced. So coming up this week, things should be a little bit more quiet with both chambers being out of session. Obviously, the issue of DHS funding is still somewhat unresolved, and Congress will have to get back to work soon on figuring out that final fiscal year 2026 funding plan for the agency. But otherwise, small business side, things are looking somewhat quiet right now.
You know, we never want to keep things too quiet. So for those of you watching, take a minute to fill out our action alert. There's a link up here on the SBIR program. Let lawmakers know how important it is to you. It's really critical that they hear from us. And with that, thank you for spending a couple minutes with Jack and me this morning, and we hope you'll have a great day. Bye.
Bye.